Welcome to this session of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. I'm your moderator tonight, Tyson James. I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists tonight. Starting from the far end, we have Dr. Joshua Swamidas, information biologist from the Washington University at St. Louis. Then we have Dr. William Lane Craig, who is professor of philosophy at Houston Christian University, as well as research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, and Dr. Andrew Loke, who is associate professor of the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Hong Kong Baptist University. Our session tonight is on new perspectives on the historical atom. We will go in chronological order, so we will start with Dr. Swamidas, then Dr. Craig, and then Dr. Loke. Each section will be 50 minutes total, and that will include 10 minutes at the end of each session for Q&A. All right, we'll now continue with Dr. William Lane Craig.
Thank you. You should all have a handout, which is an outline of my case. In addressing the question of the historical atom, we face two fundamental questions, one hermeneutical and one scientific. The hermeneutical question is, what are our biblical commitments as Christians concerning Adam and Eve? This is a question that must be pursued independently of the scientific question if we're to avoid the flawed hermeneutic of concordism. Having determined our biblical commitments, we then can turn to the second question, which is, are our biblical commitments concerning Adam and Eve compatible with the evidence of modern science? In the outline, the first 11 points address the hermeneutical question, and points 12 to 18 address the scientific question. So let me run through these briefly with you. Number one, as a result of folklore studies, we are able to identify mythical narratives on the basis of at least 10 family resemblances shared by myths. The most important of these would be the presence of etiological motifs, which are attempts to ground realities and values in the contemporary society of the author in events deep in the primordial past. This is at the very heart of the genre of myth. 2, Genesis 1 to 11, the so-called primeval history, exhibits multiple instances of 8 out of 10 of these family resemblances. And in the book, I go into these in great detail. 3, Genesis 1 to 11 may therefore be plausibly classified as mythical. 4, in view of their metaphoricalness, plasticity, and flexibility, myths need not be interpreted literalistically. When you look at myths, particularly those of the ancient Near East, you find that they are filled with metaphor and figurative language, that they are very plastic, they change over time, and they exhibit a great deal of flexibility such that different versions of the same myth can be simultaneously accepted in a society. 6, Genesis 1 to 11 need not therefore be interpreted literalistically. 7, in view of the genealogies that order the primeval narratives into a primeval history that melds seamlessly into the patriarchal narratives, Genesis 1 to 11 also displays a historical interest, including in Adam and Eve, the founding pair. There is no break between the genealogies that include Adam and Eve and their patriarchal descendants, Abraham and his progeny. Genesis 1 to 11 may therefore be plausibly classified as mytho-history. This is a label for this type of genre that was coined by the Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson, who noticed that this combination of myth with a historical interest is a particular unique genre of literature, and I think that this correctly classifies Genesis 1 to 11. 9, the New Testament confirms that Adam and Eve were regarded as historical persons since they had real-world effects outside the narratives. Many of the New Testament references to Adam and Eve could be regarded as simply references to the literary Adam and Eve. That is to say, those literary characters that appear in Genesis 2 to 3. But when in Romans 5, Paul says that as a result of Adam's sin, the death spread to all men because all men sin, he posits real world effects of Adam's fall outside the story. And therefore, Paul must be regarding Adam and Eve as genuine historical persons since they have real world effects outside the narratives. 10, we are therefore biblically committed to Adam and Eve as actual historical persons from whom all humanity has descended. 11, since Genesis 1 to 11 is mytho-historical, it is to contemporary science that we must turn in order to find the approximate date at which Adam and Eve existed. You will search in vain, I think, in a mythical narrative to find specific historical dates for these persons. Given that it needn't be interpreted literalistically, we can turn to contemporary science to date Adam and Eve. 12, we may determine the approximate time at which humans originated by looking for archaeological signatures of modern cognitive capacity, such as abstract thinking, planning depth, technological innovativeness, and symbolic behavior. It is nearly universally regarded among paleoanthropologists that these are the elements that help to make up modern cognitive capacity. And so what archaeologists do is to look for these so-called archaeological signatures that indicate abstract thinking, planning depth, technological innovativeness, and symbolic behavior. 13, paleoanthropological evidence from various scientific fields indicates that Neanderthals exhibited modern cognitive capacity. The archaeological signatures among Neanderthal remains are stunning and indicate just this kind of modern cognitive capacity that is characteristic of us, in effect. If you're not familiar with this, I want to just mention 3 especially remarkable archaeological signatures. One would be the Schöningen spears, discovered in an open pit coal mine in Germany. These wooden spears are 7 to 8 feet long. They are carefully sculpted so that the bulk of the weight of the spear is in the first 1/3 of the spear to assist with throwing. It tapers off toward the butt so that it is thinner at the butt and heavier on the head. Scientists made replicas of these spears and tested them with German Olympic javelin throwers. And it was found that these spears compared well with modern Olympic javelins, even though the athletes had never trained with these ancient wooden spears, in terms of their distance, in terms of their accuracy, and in terms of the depth of their penetration in the target. These spears were dated to between 300 and 400,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens was on the scene. So that the provenance of these spears, which were apparently used in big game hunting, they were found with the remains of a herd of horses that had been driven into a lakeside by the hunters and then slaughtered. The activity of big game hunting, of herd animals, is also indicative of collaborative behavior that probably required linguistic communication among the hunters. A second notable archaeological signature are the constructions in Bruniquel Cave in France. In this cave, which has been closed since the Pleistocene until it was opened in the 1990s, they discovered about 330 meters deep into the cave, in total darkness, these strange ring-like constructions made out of stalagmites that were cut to specific lengths, about 30 centimeters long, and then stacked on top of each other in these rings with vertical posts driven to support the structures. Nobody knows what these things were for, what purpose they served. There were fires all about, or the remains of fires, some of them on these stalagmite rings, and they were apparently unfinished. These have been dated to around 176,000 years ago. Again, long before Homo sapiens ever arrived in Europe. The excavator, Jacques Joubert, says that in order to build these, we are talking about persons who had a society that had to have communication, planning, strategy, coordination, bringing in the fire, assembling the stalagmites, cutting them, putting them together. He says this is indicative of, again, persons with linguistic ability. The final archaeological signature that I want to mention was just discovered in 2020. It was a piece of Neanderthal twine. It was made from the inner bark of a gypsum tree, and these fibers were then twisted clockwise, and then they were surrounded by other fibers twisted counterclockwise to make a 3-ply cord. And the archaeologists, again, investigating this, said this kind of construction of the reverse twisting and making a 3-ply cord is indicative of mathematical ability, which would be on the same level, they say, as linguistic ability in these persons. So these and many other signatures, I think, go to indicate that Neanderthals had fully modern cognitive capacity and therefore exhibited these human traits. These were not animals. These were not beasts that did this. 14, as the universal progenitors of mankind, Adam and Eve must therefore have been ancestral to both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. 15, the last common ancestor of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is the large-brained human species Homo heidelbergensis, whose members lived somewhere around 750,000 years ago. And on the cover of the book is a picture of Homo heidelbergensis recreated by an artist, a rather handsome fellow, I think you'll agree. At least my wife thinks so. 16, the existence of a single couple who are the progenitors of the entire human race cannot be ruled out on the basis of population genetics if they lived earlier than 500,000 years ago. Contrary to what had been claimed earlier, the genetic diversity exhibited by the contemporary human population could go back to a founding pair if that founding pair lived earlier than 500,000 years ago. 17, Adam and Eve may therefore be plausibly identified as members of the species Homo heidelbergensis living sometime prior to 750,000 years ago. 18, therefore, our biblical commitment to a primordial human pair from whom all humanity has descended is fully compatible with the scientific evidence. I'll take any questions. Thank you.
So regarding point 12 in relationship to points 17 and 18, I'm right that you don't want to, correct me if I'm wrong, but am I right in thinking that you don't want to say that modern cognitive capacity it's not a sufficient condition to being a human person, right? Like that these people, like if you had this modern cognitive capacity, that doesn't make you a person in and of itself.
Yes, I think it is sufficient that if you find these modern cognitive capacities exhibited by someone who is anatomically similar to us, has a hominin body, then you're dealing with a human being. That's a human person, as you pointed out in your earlier question time.
So is it the case that what makes Adam and Eve among all the hieroglyphs that exist, just that they're the first to exhibit that sort of like modern cognitive capacity? Basically what I'm getting at is like, what makes it so Adam and Eve among all the hieroglyphs that exist are Adam and Eve and the rest of them aren't?
Yeah, well, that they were the first humans. They were the first humans. The others were hominins, but not human. And if you were to ask me as a philosopher to explain what I mean by that, I meant they had a hominin body and a rational soul.
Okay.
And were therefore in the image of God.
So there's something metaphysical that is making it such.
I think so,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, I'm a dualist. In the last chapter of the book, I discuss substance dualism and its relevance to this issue. And so, yes, I would say that it's very possible that there was a kind of systemic macro mutation biologically, accompanied by the infusion of a rational soul by God into this founding pair, the human race.
A rational soul for you doesn't necessarily mean that you exhibit specific cognitive capacities, right? Right. Because you don't want to write like disabled, severely cognitively disabled.
That's exactly right. And also a point that did not come out in Josh's presentation is that intellectual or cognitive capacities can arise long before they find expression in archaeological signatures. They can lie latent for tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years. And then under environmental pressures, it will elicit that cognitive capacity in certain sorts of behavioral traits. And sometimes this will come and go in the archaeological record. For example, the Bruniquel cave constructions lie way out there ahead of time. And then you don't find anything like that for a long time. And so there is this gene cultural evolution that takes place within the human species that can call forth these cognitive capacities that lie there latent already. And so when we're looking for these, we are not using these definitionally. We're looking for these as evidence. Yeah. These are evidence of humanity, like fingerprint evidence for a detective. You know, it's evidential. Yes?
I would be curious, how would you understand the first sin of those very ancient Adam and Eve? Because I understood like the theological interest stems from Romans 5.
Right.
So what was the first sin?
Well, it was disobedience to God, and in some way. I don't think we need to take the narrative of the tree with its magical fruit, which if eaten would give knowledge of good and evil or confer immortality. These seem to me clearly figures of speech that are characteristic of myth, as well as the talking snake. This is part and parcel of the way myth looks. But I think we are committed, not simply by Genesis, but especially by Romans 5, to a historical fall, so that this primordial couple in some way disobeyed God, fell into sin, and experienced as a result spiritual death. I take it that the death sentence of sin is spiritual. It's alienation from God rather than physical mortality.
Hey, Bill, I got a question.
Okay.
It's not a contentious question. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on why you're going with more of a refurbishment route for Adam and Eve versus like a created without parents.
My model doesn't feature de novo creation in the way that Josh's does. I take it that the story of Adam and Eve's creation is, again, very figurative. In Genesis 2 and 3, you have God portrayed as a humanoid deity that walks in the cool of the garden in the afternoon, calling out to Adam in the bushes, forming a human statue out of dirt, and then breathing into its nose the breath of life, and then doing surgery on his side and taking out a rib and making a woman. It seems to me that this is patently figurative language, not to be interpreted literally. So I don't think that part of our biblical commitments are de novo creation. And therefore, simply to see if this is consistent with contemporary evolutionary theory, I suggest what Josh calls a refurbishment of some pre-human hominin that would involve perhaps both biological miracle as well as this infusion of a rational soul by God, a supernatural act. But it doesn't exclude de novo creation. If you want to believe that, you could believe that. But again, a lot of this depends on my genre analysis of Genesis 1 to 11 as mytho-history, that it just seems to me that a lot of this is figurative language. Yes?
I'd like to raise a question or a challenge around that characterization of Genesis. I'm a biblical scholar, and my question is actually about, I appreciate your stance in wanting to understand the theological commitments first, the scriptural commitments, and then the scientific ones.
Yes.
No student is greater than his master. So if I see Jesus interpreting something in a certain way, I want to follow his line of thought. Luke 17, he brings together the flood story and the Sodom story, one destruction by fire, one destruction by water. This is something that a number of ancient Jews do. Jude does it, Peter does it in 2 Peter. It's a certain way of reading these things. He also uses them as a model, especially the destruction by fire, for the judgment that will come at the end of age when he returns and judges things. And John the Baptist also speaks about this fiery judgment rule that Jesus will fulfill. Jesus seems very clearly to be reading the destruction by water and destruction by fire to be historical events, which would bring a challenge to the assessment, many people's assessment that Genesis 1 to 11 is myth or mythos.
Yeah. I think that Jesus of Nazareth did believe in the historical Adam, though I think that his teaching on divorce, when he says that God made them male and female, and therefore let not man separate what God has joined together, is really just a reference to the literary Adam and Eve of Genesis 2 to 3. I don't think there Jesus is teaching the historicity of Adam and Eve. He's teaching about divorce and marriage and its sanctity. And so it's sufficient to see this as an appeal to the story of Adam and Eve, the literary figures. Nevertheless, I agree with you that I think Jesus did believe that Adam and Eve were historical, even if it wasn't what he was teaching. And since I believe in the deity of Christ and believe that omniscience is an essential property of deity, I think that Jesus' belief was true, that Adam was a real historical person. And so I think that Adam was a real historical person in accordance with what Jesus taught. Now, as for many of these other New Testament references, I have a really interesting argument here that these are by and large, except for Romans 5, perhaps maybe Acts 17, these are by and large merely references to literary characters. And I say that on the basis of the very interesting phenomenon of the New Testament authors' appeal to figures of Jewish folklore and mythology. People like Janus and Jambres, who came to symbolize evil in Jewish folklore and legend, and about whom many Jewish legends originated. So even though they're mentioned in Paul's correspondence in Timothy, I don't think that commits us to the historicity of Janus and Jambres. These are just figures, literary figures of Jewish folklore. Similarly, when Jude talks about the dispute of the angel Michael with the devil over the body of Moses, this is right out of the apocryphal Jewish work, The Assumption of Moses, or the Testament of Moses. And we are not committed to the historicity of that simply because Jude cites this apocryphal story. Another great example is in Corinthians when Paul refers to the well that accompanied the Israelites on their wilderness wanderings through the desert. In Jewish folklore, it was believed that there was a well, kind of shaped like a beehive, that rolled along with the Israelites and traveled with them and supplied them water in the desert. And Paul refers to this Jewish legend and says, the rock was Christ. He interprets it symbolically that it was Christ. And we don't think that we are committed historically to the existence of such a rolling well. So in exactly the same way, the references of many of these New Testament authors to stories of the flood and other things in the primeval history, I think can be plausibly interpreted as merely literary cross-references rather than historical. Where history is required is when the characters have extra narrative effects in the real world. Sherlock Holmes is a famous fictional character, but he has no real world effects. Hamlet has no real world effects, but according to Paul, Adam did, and so cannot be merely a literary figure.
Appreciate you allowing me to jump back. Just as something, just a tiny bit of autobiographical prelude to my next question. I'm a biblical scholar. For years, I've read the Bible in certain ways, and you can go 10 years or even longer reading one way and have a dramatic shift. For me, 2 years ago in the summer, in prayer, I believe God asked me, would you start reading the Bible just to know me rather than being primarily a scholar? And I was up to the heart and I said, okay, I'll do that. And I've started to do that. And things have shifted me. Here's one thing that shifted me as I try to follow Jesus' teaching. He said all of the blood from Abel to Zechariah killed between the temple and the altar will be required of this generation because they rejected me. And he's not moving from, I don't believe he's moving from a mythical figure to a historical figure and citing a line of figures from the first.
Now, did you say from a mythical figure?
Abel, a righteous person.
He doesn't think it's mythical. He's saying that.
Yeah, I don't think it's mythical.
I don't imagine that Jesus, in his mind, if I try to reconstruct the historical Jew who made this statement, he's thinking of all of the righteous people who've been killed unjustly. All of that blood will be required of this generation. It's similar to Luke's genealogy in Luke 3, where he goes, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. When he gets to Genesis 11, 1 through 11 characters, he doesn't suddenly in his mind shift to, well, these are mythical figures. He actually is thinking of them as historical figures until he gets to find the Son of God. The way the ancient Jews thought about it, and perhaps God fears like Luke, would be that these are actually historical figures and events.
But that is my position, that these are actual historical persons, but that the narratives of them are described or told in the colorful, figurative language of myth. And with respect to precisely that saying of Jesus, this is a great example, I think, of a literary reference, because the blood from Abel to Zechariah isn't the history of Israel. It is the breadth of the Old Testament canon from Abel to Zechariah. It is a literary span that Jesus is talking about there and not a historical span, I think. So that's one of the passages I appeal to in support of my interpretation. Yes?
I would like to comment with respect also to Josh's saying that one of the key factors in his view of the dating is the relatively sudden appearance of domestication of plants and animals spreading to Europe and I suppose Asia and so forth, from the Middle East, to people who had already been there, hunter-gatherers who had been there for tens, hundreds, thousands of years, but in a relatively short period of time, as sometimes happens even today with smartphones having spread so rapidly, things like this do spread. And then I heard you mention a few minutes ago that there can be little cognitive developments in the human brain that allow things to happen, certainly earlier with speech, but in other ways. And could that not somehow be related to the Adam and Eve population there in the Middle East by this time? And the image of God and so forth. And right away, the other thing I find difficult with your 100,000 ago is that we're given the immediate descendants there of being those who are in charge of plants and those who are herders and so forth, and soon we have what are called cities.
Yeah, I don't think there's any reason to think that the invention of agriculture is the beginning of humanity. The archaeological signatures that I'm talking about and that I've described show modern cognitive capacity long before agriculture was invented.
Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years to do something so obvious with this cognitive ability.
Well, I don't know, is agriculture obvious? Maybe it wasn't to them. And how do we know exactly when they did begin to plant seeds and things? One of the interesting archaeological signatures that has been found that are hundreds of thousands of years old are grindstones. These grindstones have been found all over in Africa and the Middle East. Now, some of them were used to grind pigments, which is also very suggestive, especially of aesthetic tastes. And these pigments could be used for decoration, for body painting, for other things of that sort. But maybe grindstones were used with plants as well. I mean, how do we know? So
you don't give that much significance to the sudden development from the Paleolithic to a more Neolithic.
No. And you've got to remember the Ice Age too. The Ice Age only ended about 11,000 years ago. These Neanderthals lived through the Ice Age, where there was mile-thick ice covering much of Europe. These were really hardy survivors who had to live by their wits, and made it through. So it's not so surprising that agriculture might be delayed. This is a cultural development, and the cognitive capacity for that was there long before. One key indication of this would be cave painting. Have you ever gone online and looked at the cave paintings in France at Lascaux? Or the other cave paintings? These are magnificent paintings. When I ask contemporary people, draw a picture of a lion, or a buffalo, even if we did it in this room, they would be grotesque little stick figures and horrible things. And you look at these cave paintings, they're numinous, they are so beautiful, and so realistic, that the pride of lions that it is on one wall, it's fantastic. It's so realistic. I look at that and I think this must have been a primeval Michelangelo to do this. Now, this kind of aesthetic ability or capacity is human. There's nothing like this among beasts. So the cave paintings alone, which go back at least 17,000 years and now more recently have been discovered in Indonesia on the island of Sulawesi around 46,000 years ago. And now Neanderthal cave paintings have been discovered in Spain. This just rules out the idea that humanity didn't come into existence on this planet until the Neolithic Revolution and the invention of our agriculture. Sorry to speak with such passion, but I feel what's happening here is we are dehumanizing fellow human beings when we deny the humanity of these Neanderthals and other ancient peoples. This is offensive, I think. It's almost a form of racism, literally, because we are saying these people who had cognitive capacities that were just like ours, brain sizes the same as ours and even larger, that they're not human. And I think that's morally unconscionable. Yes?
You said, just your last statement, Neanderthals have the same brain capacity as Cro-Magnon?
They have larger.
Yeah, it was actually larger, something like 1,600 cubic centimeters than Neanderthals possessed. In fact, I read in some of the literature that over the last 10,000 years, the cranial capacity of Homo sapiens is actually shrinking.
Well, it's all electronics.
And you look at contemporary culture, and that's easy to believe. But yeah, they had the same cranial capacity or more than we did, and Homo heidelbergensis was also within the modern range. We're not talking about grunting ape men here.
So would you consider the uniqueness of humans is not only the cognitive capability, but the breath of life that God breathes into this earth, like Adam's earth, right?
Yeah, I don't think the breath of life is anything other than his just coming to life, biological life. He becomes a living thing, a nefesh. He's a living being. But the key here is that only human beings are created in the image of God in Genesis 1. What differentiates human beings from the animals is that human beings alone are created in God's image. And that's why they can be given then this function of being God's representatives on this planet and stewarding the earth and so forth.
Would that breath be an expression of instilling that image?
Yes, that's right. They couldn't. I think it's a fallacy to play off a functional interpretation against an ontological or substantial interpretation of the image, because in order to carry out their royal functions, they had to have certain capacities substantively, like rationality, self-consciousness, freedom of the will, intentionality. Yeah, the whole package. And I would say that is, now I'm speaking philosophically, that's a rational soul.
Augustine holds that view too, is what he's saying.
Yes, as Josh has often pointed out to me, the view that I've offered is very similar to what many Catholic theologians hold. That there's been an evolution of the hominin body, but then at some moment there was a supernatural infusion of a rational soul.
Is there an interpretive way that you can discern what is myth versus what is history in Genesis 1 without using Paul? I'm trying to figure out, why did you say clearly the serpent, clearly the fruit, that's clearly metaphorical and mythological, but now we're dealing with historical people when we're talking about Adam Vachava, and I'm trying to figure out what is the interpretive mechanism by which you come to that conclusion.
I don't think you can separate myth and history in the genre of mytho-history. It's not like colored marbles in a bag. It's more like coffee and cream that are mixed together. However, I think there are or can be textual clues to when the narrative is to be interpreted figuratively. And one of those clues would be when the narrative contradicts what we know the Pentateuchal author believed. And we know from Genesis 1:1 that the Pentateuchal author believed that God has created the entire physical universe and that everything material depends upon him and are just natural products of God's omnipotent power. God is a transcendent being who creates the world. And so when God is described in 2 and 3 as shaping a man out of the dirt and doing surgery on his side and walking in the garden in the cool of the afternoon, we know that these are anthropomorphisms in the mind of the Pentateuchal author because they contradict his concept of God. So that would be one of the clues, I think. Also, I do think you can compare the stories to other ancient Near Eastern myths to see points of commonality between them that might suggest that this element is meant to be interpreted figuratively rather than literally. But I don't think there is any sort of way to make a really clean division between these. Rather, I think the task for the theologian is to try to discern what are these narratives teaching us? What theological truths do they teach us? And in the book, I list about 10 of these that I think are central to the primeval history.
I'm thinking like, is it possible, I think, to say, a figure is historical, but the narrative, the person is a real historical figure, but the narrative, the methodology, the rhetoric can be methodical, allegorical, in order to bring a point, bring a message.
Yes, that's exactly the view that I'm suggesting. And it might surprise those of you who aren't biblical scholars that this point of view is very widespread among Old Testament commentators. They just don't use the same terminology. For example, John Walton resists the term myth because in our contemporary society, a myth means a falsehood, like the myth of the low calorie diet, or something of that sort. But the way the word is used by classicists and students of folklore, it does exhibit these family resemblances of myth, especially these etiological motifs. So what Walton calls it is imagistic history. Not mythohistory, but imagistic history. And again, he's very careful to say imagistic is not the same as imaginary. So he's looking for terminology. Gordon Wenham calls it proto-history. This isn't history, it's proto-history because it incorporates these mythical sorts of ideas. John Collins calls it worldview history, where it's a vehicle for expressing a worldview. Someone as conservative and committed to biblical inerrancy as J.I. Packer referred to it as dramatic history. He said these are historical persons, but this is put in a kind of dramatic form. Well, I understand what Packer was getting at, but it's not literally of the genre of drama. This is not a play like Hamlet or Macbeth, but I think it is mythohistory. I think that's a better genre analysis. And I think these other fellows are all saying something similar, but using different terminology. Yes?
Just building on the point of how would you know that it's mythohistory without just appealing to Romans? It's probably worth mentioning, right, that you do a lot of genre analysis with other ancient creationists, and that's a way of doing it.
Yeah, that's the point one about the 10 family resemblances. You can't give necessary and sufficient conditions of myth any more than you can give necessary and sufficient conditions of games. But as Wittgenstein pointed out, games have family resemblances amongst them, even if they're not all necessary and sufficient conditions. And Richard Burridge used this method to identify the genre of the Gospels as ancient biography. He assembled a list of family resemblances among ancient biography and then showed that the Gospels exhibit a considerable number of these family resemblances. And that's exactly what I tried to do with Genesis 1 to 11. And as a result, my reading of the text underwent a paradigm shift. It really did. Once I saw this as mytho-history, I thought, how could anybody else read it in any other way? How could we not have seen this? It would be like reading Aesop's fables, literally, and thinking they're about talking dogs and foxes that are resentful because they couldn't reach the grapes and other things of that sort. So I think that this, for me at least, was a sort of paradigm shift, and it's based on this genre analysis based on family resemblances.
What are some other mytho-histories?
Other examples? Well, the classicist G.S. Kirk has said that Homer's stories of the Trojan War in the Iliad belong to this sort of blend of myth and history. You've got gods that are involved in the war and intervening and so forth, and yet there really was a war between Troy and, was it Athens? Greece. Okay. And so he uses that as an example of something like this. Yes?
You gave a glance over. Would you mind if I came back with another question because you gave a glance over?
When I said that about paradigm shift, it's because when you said that, I really resonated with you.
So allow me to spell out something that I think wasn't clear earlier. If in one breath in Luke 17, Jesus speaks about Sodom's destruction, which happens in Genesis 19, in the historical part of Genesis, as something that concretely happened and is worthy of making a parallel to his own day, and he does that in parallel with the story of the flood, which happens in chapter 6 up until 9. He's thinking of them, is he not, as similarly historical. He's not seeing the divine in chapters 11 and 12.
I have nothing to say about the rest of Genesis. My study here was very focused because of the breadth of the topic. And so my focus was on Genesis 1 to 11, not about the other things like the historicity of the patriarchal narratives or the Exodus or Sodom and Gomorrah. So I really have nothing to say about that. I agreed with you that in the mind of Jesus, these are historical persons. And I don't see any reason there couldn't have been a historical flood. I just don't think it was global or worldwide. I think it's narrated that way, but I would say that that is, again, part of the mythical nature of the story, that what may have been a local flood gets dramatized to become a worldwide flood that exterminates all terrestrial life on Earth.
I'm very interested in what I hear you say about the uniqueness of Adam and Eve as souls, who are quite different from other forms of maybe human existence. And I just wonder what basis you have for that, since it sounds like, it seems to me the word soul, nephesh, applies to more forms of life than just human, and that these souls began their existence when the physical form received the breath of God, and we might say they were animated. So where does the idea come that these are now unique, distinctive, immortal beings, unlike everything else that they have in common?
Yeah, my argument is not based upon linguistics at all. Nephesh, as you know, can refer to corpses, I think, in the book of Leviticus. So it's not based on that at all. It's based upon the fact that these are human beings in the image of God. And then as a philosopher, if I'm asked, well, what is it to be a human being? I would say it is to be a rational soul in a hominin body. And that would be a philosophical position. But I'm not suggesting that that's taught in Genesis 1. That's my own philosophical, theological conviction. Right, and there are arguments in the last chapter of the book for substance dualism. I review several of these from Angus Manouche that I think make a very good case for anthropological dualism. Well, thank you very much for your interaction.